The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Welcome to another episode of Supplementing Health. There's a lot of talk about the risks of too much sugar in our diets, especially with the increased consumption that comes from processed and prepackaged foods that are very common in our day-to-day. So here with me, I have Dr. NavNirat Nibber, who is a naturopathic doctor and a medical advisor for AOR. And she is here to do a deep dive with me into exactly what happens when we consume sugar and what that means for our health long-term. Welcome, Nir. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this ginormous topic.
Okay, awesome. So then let's dive right in because like you said, it is a huge topic and there's so much to cover. So like I mentioned, there's a ton of messaging around the negative effects of sugar on the body. Can you share what the physiological impacts of sugar are?
Yeah, absolutely. What's so interesting is you always hear this blanket statement of sugar is bad, but we're never really given too many specifics. And I think today we'll really get into that. And it ultimately starts with what is happening in our body when we are exposed to different types of sugars, and we'll get into that as well. But our bodies are really well adapted at handling sugar and converting that into energy. Sugars can be classified into, all these different categories of the size of the molecule. But at the end of the day, they are fuel. So there's this complicated process of first absorbing, then we break down into those smaller subunits and then shuttle them to the tissues that need that fuel the most, the brain, the muscles. And then it's a matter of, are we storing it or are we excreting that excess? Now, of course, this sounds like a very simplified process, but it's a well-oiled machine. So the concerns really start to arise when we're talking about those excess added sugars. So these excessive sugars from things like sugary drinks or refined grains, and those can actually trigger these neuroadaptations both in our reward system in our brain that cause us to consume more, but then also how that then can impact, our heart health, weight management, and inflammatory disease. And it all can be broken down into the fact that when we consume a lot of processed sugars, we can induce inflammation, glycation, oxidative stress, and insulin dysregulation. We can get into those a little bit more, but it's really important to understand that there is a built-in process that kind of helps us utilize this fuel, but then there is that overcorrecting. And when we flood any system with too much of a good thing, that's when we really start to see those four processes I talked about.
And so you mentioned the brain and the muscles. Do all of our tissues and organs utilize the energy from sugar, or are there certain ones that are more inclined to utilize glucose and the energy that comes from that sugar?
Yeah, so yes, ultimately every cell will utilize these fuel sources. However, there is a order of preference. So we always start with the brain. Brain will always get preferential utilization. And And obviously, the different types of sugars will also have differing impacts on the brain. So, compared to other organs, our brain, it has a disproportionate energy requirement relative to its weight. So, compared to muscles, which are heavy weight, they don't need as much of it. So I guess the answer to that question is it depends on the usage and the tissue type. And yes, there is quite a lot of variability there, but our brain always kind of gets the preference first.
Fair enough. I guess it kind of runs the show, right? So that makes sense. Yeah. So then can the body tell the difference between naturally occurring sugars and those that are added in manufacturing or that are sugar replacements, or does it treat them all the same?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a tricky question because ultimately at the end of the day, the body will break it down into the glucose, the fructose, and they're called monosaccharides. So fructose and glucose, and then you can get disaccharides, which are the sucrose and lactose. And each of them do have different impacts, but the body can distinguish between the proportions of each of those. So once it's fully broken down, I guess then it's sugar is sugar, but the process of breaking down has significant impacts and they are preferentially sorted. So, for example, when we talk about added sugars, we're talking about those high fructose corn syrups, which do have negative impacts, or sucrose, which is our table sugar, and these are usually, 50 high fructose corn syrup is actually 55% of that fructose. So anything above that, again, it's that proportion of how it's made up is really going to change both its metabolism, absorption, and then ultimate impacts. But the sugar molecule itself, once in the tissue, it can then be used as a fuel. So it just depends on whether it's the fructose or the glucose.
Okay, and so another term that comes up a lot when we're talking about excess sugar and eating sugar in the diet regularly is insulin resistance. So what actually leads to cases of insulin resistance?
Yeah, this is insulin resistance is this really complex and fascinating area of research and pathology. And what it is insulin resistance is a progressive, reversible state that really is the result of our ability or inability to take up glucose into the cells, because once it's absorbed, it then needs to go into the cell, and insulin facilitates that movement or that transmission. And insulin resistance begins to develop when you're no longer, those responders are no longer listening. So those locks on the door are kind of either not being as sensitive, so then the glucose is just sitting in circulation where really it should be being taken up into the cell. So like I mentioned, it is progressive and reversible. There are periods of our lives where, we're naturally more insulin resistant, such as during growth spurts and pregnancy. But it often gets correlated directly with diabetes and blood sugar dysregulation. But I think the more appropriate and correct term is that it precedes and is more of a process that can lead to the development of diabetes rather than them being one and the same.
So are the symptoms very similar then to diabetes, or does insulin resistance have its own set of signs and symptoms that people could be looking out for?
Yeah, so because the insulin resistance precedes generally the development of diabetes, which is a disease, you will get, there's some overlap in symptoms, but there are earlier signs that you can start to tell. So with insulin resistance, things like skin tags, acanthosis nigrans, so that's that dark patches of skin on your neck and armpits, excessive thirst, which we know is one of those telltale signs for diabetes, a lot of that abdominal weight gain, fatigue, and excessive urination. Those are all also signs of the insulin resistance, and can again precede those really vast changes in blood glucose dysregulation, which leads to the diabetes.
Okay, and you'd mentioned that it's kind of a spectrum or a process that you could be on for insulin resistance. How can people correct it, or does it change depending on how far along that process someone is to how they would treat their insulin resistance?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. It is progressive. So, there does at some point come a point of, I wouldn't say no return, but difficult return, much more difficult. And then there's both modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors associated with that progression. So our genetics can help dictate how sensitive we are initially to the insulin. So do we need a lot of insulin to help get that glucose in, or do we need a little bit? Is kind of set from a genetic point of view. But then those modifiable risk factors, again, would be the lifestyle, things like exercise and the types of foods we're eating, particularly the sugar content and the sugar, there's two terms. There's a glycemic index and glycemic load of these foods. So they're going to help dictate how our body responds to that sugar and, how much sugar there is in those foods. So those are considered modifiable. And if we start to be mindful of those modifiable risk factors early on, then it's more likely to be able to reverse an insulin resistance than we would be if we just keep consuming those things.
You mentioned both glycemic index and glycemic load. What is the difference between the two?
Yes, thank you for asking this, because so many people don't know the difference and often just go to glycemic index, because I think that's the one that has more of the fame. But glycemic index is how fast the carbohydrates or these sugars are actually broken down and enter into your bloodstream, whereas the glycemic load is the actual total amount of those sugars in a serving of particular food. And when I'm saying sugars here, I'm using them more as the carbohydrates, those simple carbohydrates, rather than, it can also include those added carbohydrates, but it's important to understand, again, those ratios and to put into context what is both the glycemic index and glycemic load. So a lot of times when guidelines say, avoid foods like carrots have a higher glycemic index, but carrots, as we know, are quite good for us. So yes, the carrots do infuse those sugars quickly into the system, but the glycemic load that they have is actually quite low. So that it's not like there's a ton of sugar in that food anyway. And also, it's in combination with fibers and all these antioxidants. So it's very important when we're talking about management to look at both glycemic index and glycemic load.
So when you're looking at the glycemic index diet, and there is the list of like green foods, kind of yellow foods, and red foods, is the glycemic load taken into account when those lists are created, or is that an additional factor that should be considered?
That's a very good point. It's up until recently hasn't been considered, but I think more and more research that comes out and more of the diabetes support literature that's coming out is taking into account the glycemic load. So I think it would depend more on where you're getting your information and how current it is.
Okay, and then so how does eating with the index in mind help to correct insulin resistance?
Because essentially what you're doing is you're ensuring that when you are exposing your cells, or sorry, when you're intaking glucose and absorbing it, then you can slowly infuse that sugar over time. And so the insulin isn't being hit all at once to have to help absorb all of this glucose all at once. It's being, it's like if you're at a line and, we're at a grocery store and everybody comes in all at once, and then you only have a certain number of those cashiers to process that, versus, if people are slowly trickling in, and then it's less of a burden for those cashiers. So essentially with a low glycemic index food and glycemic load food, you're saying we're going to regulate how much is actually coming in so that the insulin and the insulin receptors aren't overburdened, so that it's this huge flux all at once.
So then for people that want to take the glycemic load into consideration when they're choosing their foods, are there things they should be looking for on the labels to help them decide where they would fit on the spectrum?
Yeah, so that would be the total amount of sugars in the food. Again, with vegetables and stuff, we're not looking at the packaging, but when we are looking at added sugars, we really want to be mindful of on those packages, making sure that it's less than 5% of our daily caloric intake from the sugar. So, anything where it says like 24 grams of sugar, this is where we really need to be careful and cognizant, and always be looking at the serving size of each of these foods, because sometimes they'll give you sugar content just for that small portion. But as we know, sometimes we eat the whole box of macaroni, and then you're looking at your total. So calculate your total sugar intake for the day, and it should be less than 5% of your total caloric intake. So if you're at 1,200 calories a day, which is quite low, I thought that would be for weight loss, but let's say 2,100 calories a day, then yeah, you would just want to be at that less than 5%. So there's a lot of tools, apps like MyFitnessPal, that I think people are using more often, just to understand the breakdown and how they're consuming their macros, and then how added sugars can play into that. So I think that's kind of an exciting opportunity now that we have, these tools right in our pocket to help us manage that.
It's true. You just have to be good about actually logging all the stuff you're eating so that you can see a true picture of it, right?
Yeah.
And when you're mentioning the portion sizes, I know drinks are a terrible culprit for that. They'll say for 250 mils, but the bottle will be 500 or something. So you're actually getting double the sugar that it makes it seem like. So
yeah, and WHO actually recommended that with children to not drink fruit juices before the age of 1, just because of that really high sugar content. I mean, I would argue that that could even be increased in age. Most of us shouldn't be drinking these really, really high sugar concentrated drinks. And in fact, juices present this interesting conundrum, because while a juice, everybody thinks, hey, this is fruit. It's fruit sugars, so they must be good. But fruit sugars are usually in our body and throughout history have been considered manageable, because fruit comes as a whole fruit, that you're adding in these fibers, you're adding in all of these other components that change the total weight of the sugar in that fruit, so that you're not getting this influx of sugars all at once. What juices do is they distill and concentrate those sugars so that you're, again, getting that hit all at once, which really changes, while it might be from the same source, it does change how your body's going to react to it.
That's actually one of the things I was kind of wondering about, is if like the different types of sugar that you mentioned, like fructose, glucose, sucrose, lactulose, etc., Do they impact the insulin resistance response differently depending on which sugar you're consuming?
Yeah. So, and the difference lies in the different pathways of metabolism. We know that glucose is absorbed and causes this insulin response. But then something like fructose, that consumption is not insulin mediated, so it's actually going to your liver and then being broken down and metabolized into glucose from the liver. So that pathway is going to look very different. Lactose has to then be modified in the microbiome, and oftentimes it gets used as a prebiotic. So absolutely, what's going to happen is, and there's lots of charts that help support the grading and the impact of each of these different molecules, but it'll tell us what your insulin response is going to be. Fructose is not going to have that. Glucose in different foods, you can see, depending on fiber intake, how that's going to change. And what's interesting is our insulin response can be measured. There's the gold standard is quite an invasive process for assessing your insulin response. It's a eugenic clamp technique, which is not super accessible. But what we can see and start measuring is serum blood flow. So if we have, or blood sugar, and that we do have really fast tests for. So you can start to see, after eating and consuming different foods, how your blood sugar is starting to respond. And what was interesting, there was a study that was done, I want to say 2015, and subjects received a drink that was either pure fructose or glucose. And then they also did a functional MRI. So they're actually seeing where it goes in the brain. And what was interesting is that the group receiving the glucose had this significantly reduced amount of the cerebral blood flow into this particular area of the brain that is responsive for that blood sugar reward pathway. And actually, it was diverting more of the blood flow to this nutritive reward pathway. So it's saying, let's make sure that there's a shut-off mechanism so that when we're full and when we've received the nutrients we need, it can shut off. Whereas the fructose group, it didn't really reduce that hunger, so they didn't get that shut-off mechanism. And so that's often why anything that's really high in fructose it's not going to induce your satiety. So you can actually then end up increasing a lot of the total calories consumed, because it's more, I guess it's not activating that same reward pathway, the nutritive reward pathway in your brain. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, just in that, just from the brain perspective, and this can get really complicated really fast, but just that each of our responses is going to be so different depending on what sugar we're exposed to. So yeah, both from the insulin management perspective, the hormones that it's supporting, and then also from your brain response and the neurotransmitters that are being activated and the pathways, reward pathways in your brain.
Yeah, that is super interesting. So then there's the perspective out there that natural sweeteners, such as like honey or maple syrup, are considered healthier.
Mm.
Is that really true in this context?
Like a good naturopath, I'm going to say it depends on the person. Depends on how, again, we mentioned those genetic components, we mentioned all of these things, but when we look at the breakdown of things like honey, it's 30% glucose and 40% fructose. What we're saying is all of these, honey, maple syrup, agave, they're all going to have different components of the fructose and glucose combination because they're disaccharides. So they still have to be broken down as monosaccharides. So in someone who is fairly insulin, I guess, competent, and they have good sensitivity, they may be better attuned at something that has a appropriate ratio that skews more towards glucose, because that's going to be how it gets taken up into cells. And then also we need to look at someone's liver status. Are they able to, if there's a high fructose content, are they able to have the liver functioning that will allow for appropriate breakdown of that fructose and excretion, or is it just going to sit there, increase your triglycerides, and then again lead to more of that weight gain, and basically is it going to wreak havoc in the liver? So the natural sweeteners, whether they're good or bad, really depends on who they're in. But is it preferential to something like the table sugar or the high fructose corn syrup? Yes.
Makes sense. Okay, so then shifting a little bit, every day there's more and more exposure to artificially sweetened foods and drinks. And even in some cases, supplements and stuff are now using them. Like if you take gummy supplements or some of the drink powders, they're now sweetened with, sucralose or aspartame or any of these artificial sweeteners. Are there any concerns around using those artificial sweeteners? They're made out to be healthier, than like a healthier option, but how do they play into this picture?
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that they're certainly not transparent about what impact it can have. And a lot of times the sweetness quotient of these sugar alternatives is actually quite a bit higher than what's advertised. So yes, they're not considered real sugars, but they still activate those sweetness reward pathways, like I mentioned, in the brain, and that's going to then possibly lead to inability to shut off those satiety signals that get sent out. So you end up consuming more calories. There is a lot of discussion right now about toxicity, particularly in some things that, like aspartame, which can cross blood-brain barrier, and is that actually toxic? Are we doing a lot more damage? So it's still being uncovered, the full impact, but certainly I would say that if we're looking at some of these artificial sweeteners or alternatives, really staying away from the saccharine or aspartame or anything with maltodextrose, which I guess goes back to when you're looking on a label. And again, the content of it, things like stevia are a little bit better if you do need a sweetener. But I think what's also interesting is we need to start getting attuned to the degree of sweetness or the reward pathways that sweetness induces. So when we have something really sweet, it's activating two pathways in our brain. And this is often why people can get these sugar addictions, is because it is a dopamine-led reward pathway that's saying, you're getting nutrients. This is really good. Keep consuming. So that's one reward pathway that it activates. And then the second reward pathway that it activates in the brain is just the pleasure center. So the I guess happiness response. And so it can really induce that reward, the same reward pathway that gets activated by things like nicotine or other addictive substances. So it really can be addictive. And that's where we need to be really mindful. But I think I got away from your original question.
That's okay. It's super interesting to hear how it kind of plays into that whole cravings piece as well. But unfortunately, we've actually reached our time for today. However, we'll be having you join us again next week to continue this discussion, and we can dive in a little deeper into that blood-brain barrier piece that you were talking about there and how it affects our neurological pathways. So listeners can tune in next week to learn more about the influence sugars have on those various body systems, such as the brain and our cardiovascular system, and even our digestive health.
Yeah, we're going down the rabbit hole, folks. So we might as well enjoy the ride. It is a deep rabbit hole, and there's so much that we can discuss. But thank you so much for today.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.